You were never invisible to me. I just chose to look away because it was easier. The words would come later, heavy with regret, but on that cold evening in downtown Manhattan, Adrian Blake did not even know her name. The cafe was quiet in that polished, expensive way, the kind where conversation stayed low and every cup was placed gently on marble tables. Outside, the wind pushed between the buildings like a warning, but inside everything felt controlled, predictable, safe. Sophie Hayes moved quickly between tables, her worn sneakers silent against the dark floor, her tray balanced with practiced ease. She did not belong in a place like this. Not really, but she had learned how to disappear into it, to become part of the background. Another pair of hands, another quiet smile, another person no one remembered. Adrian sat near the window, dressed in a tailored coat that probably cost more than Sophie made in a month. His attention was fixed on his phone, his expression unreadable, distant. When she approached, he did not look up, not even when she set the cup down in front of him, not even when her elbow brushed the edge of the table and the coffee tipped, spilling in a dark arc across his sleeve. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Slowly, Adrian lifted his gaze, eyes cold, assessing, already judging. Sophie froze, her breath catching, her fingers tightening around the tray. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, reaching for napkins, her voice steady but soft. It was an accident. He did not respond right away. He simply stared at the stain, then at her, as if measuring something invisible, as if deciding how much she was worth. "Do you always make mistakes like this?" he asked finally, his tone flat, controlled, but edged with something sharper, something dismissive. Sophie swallowed, forcing herself to meet his eyes for just a second before looking away. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I will fix it." She reached out, careful, gentle, dabbing at the fabric as if she could erase what had already happened. Around them, no one spoke. No one stepped in. Because this was normal. Because people like her were supposed to apologize. And people like him were supposed to decide if that apology mattered. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Adrian leaned back slightly, pulling his arm away from her touch as if it annoyed him more than the stain itself. "Just leave it," he said. "You have done enough." The words landed heavier than they sounded, and for a moment Sophie stood there, caught between staying and stepping away. Then she nodded, once small and controlled, and turned back toward the counter. But something in her expression had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, the way a light dims before it goes out. Adrian watched her for a second longer than necessary, though he did not understand why. To him, she was just another careless server, another distraction, another person who did not matter. And yet, as she disappeared behind the counter, something unfamiliar lingered in the air. Not guilt, not yet, just a faint, almost imperceptible sense that something had shifted, that something small had been broken. And neither of them realized that this moment, this simple mistake, would be the beginning of everything he was about to lose. The rest of the evening moved forward, but something inside Sophie did not. She stood behind the counter, her hands moving automatically as she wiped surfaces, stacked cups, and refilled orders. Yet her mind kept replaying the same moment again and again. The way he had looked at her. Not angry, not even frustrated, just dismissive, as if she were a problem to be erased, not a person standing right in front of him. She had felt embarrassment before. She had been corrected, rushed, even ignored. But this was different. This felt like being reduced to nothing. Across the cafe, Adrian remained at his table, though his attention was no longer on his phone. His sleeve was still faintly stained, the fabric darkened where the coffee had soaked in, but he did not seem concerned about it anymore. Instead, his gaze drifted occasionally toward the counter, toward the space where Sophie worked. He did not understand why. It was not curiosity. It was not interest. It was something quieter, more unfamiliar. A disruption in his usual sense of control. He had spent years learning how to read people, how to measure intentions, how to identify who wanted something from him before they even spoke. It was a skill that had protected him, built his empire, kept him untouchable. And yet, the girl behind the counter had not reacted the way he expected. No nervous laughter. No exagerati de palegi. No attempt to fix the situation beyond what was necessary. Just a quiet acceptance, and then distance. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Sophie finished her shift an hour later, her body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical work. She stepped outside into the cold night air, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself as the city moved on without noticing her. Traffic passed in long streams of light. People walked quickly with purpose, and somewhere in the distance a siren echoed through the streets. She stood still for a moment, letting the cold settle into her skin, grounding herself. Then she reached in her bag and pulled out a small, worn sketchbook. The edges were frayed, the cover softened by time and use. It was the one thing she carried everywhere, the one place where she could still feel like herself. She flipped it open slowly, her fingers brushing over familiar pages filled with faces, moments, fragments of strangers captured in quiet lines. Then she turned to a blank page. For a second, she hesitated. Then she began to draw. The lines came quickly, instinctively, as if her hand already knew what her mind was still trying to process. A sharp jaw, a distant gaze, shoulders held in perfect control. But as the sketch took shape, something changed. The version of him on the page was not the same as the man at the table. His expression was different, softer, not kinder, but tired, alone. Sophie paused, her pencil hovering just above the paper. "You look like someone who forgot how to see people," she murmured under her breath, not realizing she had spoken aloud. She stared at the drawing for a long moment, then closed the sketchbook gently, as if sealing something inside it. Back inside the cafe, Adrian finally stood to leave. He placed his payment on the table without looking at the amount, without waiting for change. As he walked toward the door, his eyes flicked once more toward the counter. But she was gone. The space where she had been felt strangely empty, as if something essential had been removed. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting him instantly, sharp and clean. For a brief moment he considered, turning back, asking someone her name, saying something, but the thought passed just as quickly as it came. He had no reason to. She was just a waitress, just another person in a city of millions. And yet, as he walked down the sidewalk, something stayed with him. Not her face, not her voice, but the absence she left behind. Quiet, unexplained, and growing just enough to follow him into the night. The next morning began long before the sun fully rose. The sky over Manhattan still painted in pale gray as Sophie sat near the window of a small, quiet diner 2 blocks from her apartment. The coffee in front of her had already gone cold, untouched, as her attention stayed fixed on the sketchbook resting open on the table. The drawing from a night before stared back at her, unfinished but clear enough to hold a presence she could not ignore. She traced the edge of the page lightly with her finger, her brows drawing together as if she were trying to understand something deeper than lines and shadows. Around her, the diner buzzed softly with early morning regulars, construction workers in worn jackets, nurses grabbing quick breakfast before long shifts, people who moved through life with purpose but without luxury. This was her world, grounded, imperfect, real. And yet, the image she had drawn did not belong here. It belonged somewhere distant, controlled, untouchable. She closed the sketchbook slowly, slipping it back into her bag as she stood and headed toward the counter to pay. Her shift at the cafe would start again in less than an hour, and she could not afford to be late. Not today, not after last night. Back at the cafe, the air felt exactly the same as it always did, warm, polished, predictable. But Sophie did not move through it the same way. There was a quiet tension in her shoulders now, a careful distance in the way she spoke to customers, as if she were placing a small barrier between herself and the world around her. She smiled when necessary. She responded when spoken to. But something essential had pulled inward, protected, guarded. Midway through her shift, the door opened with a soft chime, and without thinking, her eyes lifted toward it. For a fraction of a second, her breath caught. Adrian Blake stepped inside, his presence filling the room. without effort, his coat draped perfectly over his shoulders, his expression as composed as it had been the night before. He paused briefly, scanning the space, and then his gaze found her. This time, he did not look away. Sophie felt it immediately, the weight of his attention, but instead of freezing, she turned back toward the counter, her movements steady, controlled. If he noticed, he did not react. He walked to the same table by the window and took his seat, placing his phone down with deliberate calm. A different server approached him this time, a younger man who greeted him quickly, nervously, eager to please. Adrian gave his order without hesitation, his tone neutral, his attention already drifting back toward the counter. Toward her. He told himself it was nothing. Just a habit. Just unfinished irritation from the night before. But when the server returned with his coffee, Adrian found himself watching closely, noticing the difference in how it was placed, the slight tremor in the server's hand, the overly polite smile. It felt wrong. Not worse. Just less real. Sophie continued her work, but her awareness of him never fully disappeared. It sat at the edge of her senses, quiet but constant, like a distant sound she could not quite block out. At one point, she passed near his table, her tray balanced carefully, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She did not slow down. She did not acknowledge him. And yet, as she moved past, Adrian spoke. Wait. The word was soft, not a command, but it stopped her all the same. Slowly, she turned, her expression calm but unreadable. Yes, she said. Adrian held her gaze for a moment, as if searching for something he could not name. About last night, he began, his voice quieter than before, lacking the sharp edge it had carried earlier. The coffee. It was not a problem. Sophie studied him for a second, her eyes steady, her posture composed. Then she gave a small nod. I understand, she said simply. No apology. No gratitud. Just acknowledgement. Adrian frowned slightly, caught off guard by the absence of reaction. That is all, he added, almost as if he needed to finish the thought. Sophie nodded once more. Have a good day, she said, her tone polite but distant, and then she turned away without waiting for a response. Adrian watched her go, something tightening subtly in his chest, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he had not corrected a mistake. He had not regained control of a situation. He had only confirmed something he did not yet understand. And somewhere between her quiet words and her refusal to give him more than that, Adrian felt the first hint of something he had not expected to feel at all. He had been dismissed. The shift should have ended quietly, like any other, but tension has a way of building in silence before it finally breaks. By late afternoon, the cafe had filled with a different kind of crowd. Well-dressed professionals, sharp voices, controlled laughter, people who carried their confidence like armor. Sophie moved through them with the same careful precision, her steps measured, her expression composed. But inside, the distance she had created that morning was beginning to strain. It was harder to hold onto than she expected, harder to stay untouched. Adrian remained at his table longer than usual, his empty cup sitting untouched for several minutes as he watched the room without appearing to. Every movement Sophie made seemed to pull his attention back, not because she demanded it, but because she refused to. It challenged something in him, something that had always expected a reaction, expected engagement, expected acknowledgement. And she gave him none of it. When the cafe manager approached Sophie near the counter, his voice low but firm, Adrian noticed the shift immediately. The manager's posture was rigid, his expression tight, with controlled frustration. Sophie stood still, listening, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her face calm but pale. We received a complaint, the manager said, his tone edged with impatience. About your behavior last night. Sophie's brows drew together slightly. My behavior, she repeated softly. A customer felt you were dismissive, he continued. Unprofessional, that you did not handle the situation properly. For a moment, Sophie did not respond. Not because she did not understand, but because she did, too clearly. Her gaze flickered briefly across the room, not landing anywhere, just passing through the space where Adrian sat. Then she looked back at the manager. I apologized, she said quietly. I did what I could. The manager exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That is not the point. In this place, perception matters more than intention. You know that. Sophie felt the words settle heavily, pressing against something already fragile inside her. She nodded once, slowly. Yes, she said. Adrian's jaw tightened as he listened, the realization forming faster than he wanted to admit. The complaint. It had to be from him, or at least because of him. He had not filed anything directly, but his reaction, his tone, his presence, it had set something in motion. And now she was paying for it. A strange discomfort moved through him, unfamiliar and unwelcome. The manager continued, his voice lowering further. This is your final warning, Sophie. We cannot afford mistakes like that again. She nodded again, her fingers tightening slightly against each other, but her voice remained steady. Understood. The manager walked away without another word, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any raised voice. Sophie remained still for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on nothing, her breathing slow and controlled. Then she turned, reaching for a stack of clean cups, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But something had. Adrian pushed his chair back suddenly, the movement sharper than intended. The sound drew a few glances, but he did not notice. He walked toward the counter, his steps direct, his expression unreadable but tense beneath the surface. Sophie looked up as he approached, her face returning instantly to that neutral calm she had learned to wear. Can I help you? She asked, her voice even. Adrian held her gaze, searching again for something that remained just out of reach. Did you get in trouble because of me? He asked, his tone low, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Sophie did not answer right away. She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether the question even deserved a response. Then she spoke. It is part of the job, she said simply. Adrian frowned, the answer landing wrong, incomplete. That is not what I asked. Sophie's expression did not change, but there was a quiet firmness in her eyes now. And it does not matter, she replied. The words were not defensive. They were final. Adrian felt something shift again, sharper this time, cutting through his usual certainty. It should matter, he said, almost more to himself than to her. Sophie shook her head slightly, a small movement but enough. Not to you, she said. The sentence was soft, but it landed with more force than anything she had said before. For the first time, Adrian had no immediate response, no control over the direction of the moment. Sophie held his gaze for just a second longer, then looked away, turning back to her work. Conversation closed. Adrian stood there for a brief moment, the noise of the cafe returning around him, louder now, more distant at the same time. And as he finally turned to leave, something followed him that he could not shake. Not anger, not irritation, something far more uncomfortable. The realization that for once, someone had seen him clearly and decided he was not worth the effort. By the time the evening crowd began to thin, the weight of the day had settled into Sophie's shoulders like something she could no longer ignore. Every movement felt heavier, every smile more deliberate, as if she were performing a version of herself that was slowly becoming harder to maintain. The warning from her manager echoed quietly in the back of her mind, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. It was not the first time she had been reminded that in a place like this, her value depended on how easily she could be overlooked and how quickly she could recover from being diminished. What made this time different was not the warning itself, but the reason behind it, or at least what she believed the reason to be. Across the city, Adrian stepped into the quiet of his penthouse, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than usual. The space was immaculate, every surface perfectly arranged, every detail curated to reflect control and success. Normally, it brought him a sense of calm, a reassurance that everything was exactly where it should be. Tonight it felt empty. He loosened his tie, walking slowly toward the wide windows that overlooked the skyline, the city lights stretching endlessly beneath him. But instead of the usual satisfaction, his mind returned again and again to the same moment. Not the coffee, Not the mistake. But her words. Not to you. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the tension in his chest refusing to settle. He had built his life on clarity, on understanding people, on staying one step ahead. Yet there was nothing clear about the way she had. Looked at him. No expectation. No interest. No fear. Just distance. It unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. The next day, the cafe was busier than usual, a steady stream of customers filling every table, the air thick with overlapping conversations and the constant hum of movement. Sophie worked through it all without pause, her focus sharp, her pace steady, but something in her had shifted further. The distance she had created was no longer just protection. It was becoming resolve. Midway through the afternoon, a group of well-dressed clients entered, their voices louder than necessary, their presence demanding attention. They took the table near the window, the same one Adrian had occupied the day before. Sophie approached with her usual calm, taking their orders, her tone polite but reserved. As she turned to leave, one of the men laughed, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Careful with the drinks this time," he said, his smile thin, knowing. "We heard about last night." The words were casual, almost joking, but they landed with precision. Sophie paused for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening slightly around her notepad before she nodded once. "It will not happen again," she said, her voice even. The men exchanged glances, amused, their attention already shifting away from her as if the moment were insignificant. But it was not insignificant. Not to her. Behind the counter, another server leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're friends with that guy from yesterday," he muttered. "Word travels fast around here." Sophie gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but inside, something settled into place. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, final. That evening, Adrian returned again. He told himself it was coincidence, that he simply preferred the location, the atmosphere, the convenience. But when he stepped inside and his eyes immediately searched for her, even he could not fully believe that explanation. He found her near the counter, speaking softly to another customer, her posture straight, her movements controlled. She did not look at him when he entered, not even for a second. He took his usual seat, but this time he did not wait. When she passed near his table, he spoke her name. Sophie. It was the first time he had said it, and the sound of it felt unfamiliar in his voice. She stopped, slowly turning toward him, her expression calm but guarded. "Yes," she replied. Adrian hesitated, just briefly, as if choosing his words with more care than he was used to. "I want to clarify something," he said. "What happened the other night? I did not file any complaint." Sophie studied him, her eyes steady, searching but not hopeful. "That does not change anything," she said quietly. Adrian frowned, the response hitting harder than he expected. "It should," he insisted. Sophie shook her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said. "It really does not." There was no anger in her voice. No accusation. Just truth. And in that truth, Adrian felt something shift again, deeper this time, more difficult to ignore. For the first time, he began to understand that this was not about a single moment or a single mistake. It was about how easily he had reduced her to something small, something forgettable, and how impossible it was now to undo that. The moment lingered long after Sophie walked away, but this time it did not fade quietly into the background. It stayed with her, steady and undeniable, settling into a decision she could no longer avoid. By the end of her shift, the cafe felt smaller than it ever had before, the polished walls and soft lighting no longer comforting but confining. Every glance, every whispered comment, every subtle reminder of her place pressed against her like invisible weight. When she finally stepped into the back room to clock out, her hands moved with practiced calm, but her chest felt tight, her breath measured as if she were holding something in place that was ready to break. Her manager stood nearby, reviewing paperwork, barely looking up as she approached. "You are leaving early tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Private event. We need everyone at their best." Sophie nodded once. "I will be here," she replied. He gave a brief acknowledgement, already distracted, already moving on. To him, it was routine. To her, it was the last confirmation she needed. She stepped out into the night again, the city alive in its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside her. This time, she did not pause. She did not take out her sketchbook. She walked straight down the street, her steps steady, her gaze forward, as if she had already chosen a direction and refused to look back. In her small apartment, the silence greeted her like an old companion. The space was modest, barely enough for what she needed, but it was hers. A single lamp cast a warm glow across the worn furniture, the walls decorated with small sketches and unfinished pieces that carried fragments of her thoughts, her observations, her quiet understanding of the world. She placed her bag down carefully, then reached for her sketchbook, flipping it open to the drawing of Adrian. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. The lines were still strong, still clear, but something about it felt distant now. Incomplete in a different way. She picked up a pencil, hesitated, then slowly closed the book instead. No, she whispered to herself, her voice soft but certain. It was not the drawing that needed a change. It was her. The next morning came with a strange sense of clarity. Sophie arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, her posture straight, her movements calm, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. Not guarded, not withdrawn, decided. The private event brought in a new level of pressure, high-profile guests, sharper expectations, every detail scrutinized. The staff moved quickly, efficiently, the tension beneath the surface almost tangible. Sophie worked through it all with quiet precision, her focus unwavering, her expression composed. Adrian arrived halfway through the event, his presence once again shifting the atmosphere around him without effort. Conversations adjusted, attention shifted, the room subtly recalibrating to accommodate him. But this time, Sophie did not feel it the same way. When she saw him, there was no tightening in her chest, no flicker of hesitation, just recognition and distance. As she approached his table to deliver a tray of drinks for the group he sat with, one of the men from the previous day leaned back in his chair, his tone amused, careless. "Look who it is," he said, glancing between Adrian and Sophie. "Your favorite waitress." A few quiet laughs followed, light, dismissive, the kind that carried just enough edge to linger. Adrian's expression hardened slightly, a flicker of something sharp crossing his features. "That is enough," he said, his voice low but firm. The table fell quiet, surprised by the shift, but the damage had already been done. Sophie placed the drinks down carefully, one by one, her movements steady, unaffected on the surface. But when she finished, she did not step back into silence. She looked directly at Adrian, her gaze calm, clear, and unshaken. "I will not be serving your table anymore," she said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They carried a weight that silenced the space around them more effectively than any raised voice could. Adrian stared at her, caught completely off guard, his usual control slipping just enough to reveal something raw beneath it. "You cannot just decide that," one of the men interjected, half amused, half annoyed. Sophie did not look at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can." She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out the small order pad she had been using all day, and placed it gently on the table in front of Adrian. Not thrown, not forced, just set down with intention. Then she removed the apron itself, folding it once, neatly, and placing it beside the pad. The room remained silent, every movement watched, every second stretched. Sophie met Adrian's eyes one last time, her expression steady, not angry, not hurt, simply resolved. "You were right about one thing," she said softly. "People like me should not stay where they are not respected." And with that, she turned and walked away. No hositashchen, no glance back, just a quiet, undeniable exit that left behind something far louder than any argument. Adrian remained seated, the weight of the moment pressing in around him, his gaze fixed on the empty space where she had been. And for the first time, the loss was not subtle. It was immediate, and it was entirely his. The silence she left behind did not disappear when the door closed. It stayed. It settled into the air, into the table, into the space where her presence had once moved so quietly it had been easy to ignore. Now it was impossible to miss. Adrian remained seated, his eyes fixed on the folded apron and the small order pad resting in front of him, objects so ordinary yet suddenly heavy with meaning. Around him, conversation slowly resumed, cautious at first, then louder, as if people were trying to push the moment away, to return to something more comfortable. But Adrian could not. One of the men across from him let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "That was dramatic," he said, reaching for his drink. "She really thinks she matters." The words hung in the air, careless, dismissive, familiar. Words Adrian himself had spoken in different ways at different times. But now they landed differently. Sharper, colder. He looked up slowly, his gaze settling on the man with a calm intensity that immediately quieted the table. "She does," Adrian said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that left no room for argument. The man blinked, caught off guard, his smirk fading slightly. "I did not mean it like that," he muttered, shifting in his seat. Adrian did not respond. He pushed his chair back, the movement controlled but final, and stood. The meeting, the event, the expectations, none of it seemed to matter in that moment. He reached into his coat, placing a card on the table without looking at anyone else. "Finish without me," he said simply, and walked away. Outside, the air felt colder than before, sharper against the skin as he stepped onto the sidewalk. For a moment, he stood still, his gaze scanning the street as if expecting to see her just beyond the door, as if she might still be within reach if he moved quickly enough. But she was gone. Of course she was. And for the first time, that fact did not feel temporary. It felt final. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavy, as something inside him began to shift in a way he could not ignore. He had built his life on control, on precision, on the ability to fix problems the moment they appeared. But this was not a problem he could solve with a decision or a transaction. This was something he had already broken, and she had chosen to walk away from it. Back in her apartment, Sophie sat near the window, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass as she held her sketchbook in her hands. She had not opened it since leaving the cafe, not because she was avoiding it, but because she no longer needed it in the same way. The drawing of Adrian remained inside, unchanged, but the feeling behind it had shifted. What once felt like curiosity now felt like clarity. She flipped through the pages slowly, stopping on sketches of strangers, small moments captured in quiet detail, people she had observed without being seen. For years, she had watched the world. Like this, understanding others without expecting to be understood in return. But something about that night had changed the direction of that understanding. She closed the sketchbook gently, placing it beside her, and leaned back in her chair, her eyes lifting toward the dark sky beyond the window. There was uncertainty ahead, of course. No job waiting, no plan fully formed. But there was also something she had not felt in a long time. Space. The next morning, Adrian returned to the cafe again, earlier than before, his steps purposeful, his expression set with a determination that had replaced the uncertainty from the night before. The cafe looked the same polished surfaces, the same soft lighting, the same quiet hum of activity. But she was not there. He knew at the moment he stepped inside, even before he confirmed it with a glance around the room. Something essential was missing. He approached the counter, his posture straight, his voice calm but direct. "The waitress from yesterday," he said. "Sophie, when is her next shift?" The manager looked up, his expression polite but distant. "She no longer works here," he replied. Adrian felt the words settle with a finality that tightened in his chest. "Then where can I find her?" he asked. The manager hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing the question. "We do not share personal information," he said carefully. Adrian held his gaze, the silence between them stretching for a moment before he nodded once. "Understood," he said, but as he turned to leave, something in his expression had changed. Not frustration, not anger, resolve. For the first time, Adrian Blake was not walking away from something inconvenient. He was walking towards something he had never had to fight for before, and he was not going to stop until he found her. The search did not begin with certainty. It began with absence. Adrian stepped out of the cafe and into the moving rhythm of the city, but this time, he did not blend into it. He moved against it, scanning faces, watching reflections in windows, slowing at corners where people gathered, as if she might appear simply because he expected her to. But New York did not work that way. People disappeared here every day without a trace. And for someone like Sophie, someone who had learned how to remain unnoticed, it was easier. Still, Adrian did not stop. He returned to the same streets later that afternoon, then again as evening approached, walking past small diners, corner stores, quiet apartment buildings, places he would have never looked twice at before. Each door felt like a possibility. Each passing face carried a brief flicker of hope that faded just as quickly. He told himself this was temporary, that he would find her quickly, fix what had happened, restore the balance he was used to controlling. But as the hours passed, that belief began to thin. Back across the city, Sophie stepped into a narrow community art space tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore, a place most people passed without noticing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and old wood, the walls lined with canvases in different stages of completion. It was not glamorous. It was not polished, but it was real. A woman behind a front desk looked up as Sophie entered, her expression warm with recognition. "You came back," she said with a small smile. Sophie nodded, setting her bag down gently. "If the offer is still there," she replied. The woman gestured toward a small table near the back. "We could use help setting up for the weekend exhibit," she said. "It is not much pay, but it is a start." Sophie smiled faintly, the kind that reached her eyes this time. "It is enough," she said. She moved through the space slowly, taking in the unfinished pieces, the quiet dedication in every brushstroke left behind by someone who had created without guarantee of being seen. It felt familiar in a way the cafe never had, like a place where effort mattered more than perception. She reached into her bag, pulling out her sketchbook, hesitating for just a second before opening it again. The drawing of Adrian was still there, unchanged, but now it felt like a closed chapter instead of an open question. She turned the page. Later that evening, Adrian stood outside another cafe, his reflection faint in the glass as he paused, considering whether to step inside. He had already asked at 3 other places, describing her in simple terms, a waitress, quiet, dark hair, steady eyes. Each time, the answer had been the same. A polite shake of the head. No recognition. No direction. For the first time, uncertainty settled deeper than inconvenience. He was not used to this, not used to searching without answers, not used to being unable to reach something he wanted. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the stillness. He glanced at the screen. A message from his assistant, a reminder about a meeting he had already missed. Another about a call that had been rescheduled twice. His world, the one built on precision and expectation, was beginning to shift around him. And yet he did not respond. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze returning to the street. Because none of that felt urgent anymore. Not compared to this. The next morning, Sophie stood in the art space, sunlight filtering through the front windows, catching on dust in the air and soft colors on canvas. She worked quietly, arranging pieces, adjusting lighting, her movements careful but confident. There was no pressure to be perfect here, no expectation to disappear. For the first time in a long time, she was not trying to become invisible. She was simply present. As she stepped back to look at a display, the woman from the front desk approached her, holding a small flyer. "We are opening to the public this weekend," she said. "You should put something up. Your work deserves to be seen." Sophie hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her sketchbook. "I do not know if it is ready," she admitted. The woman smiled gently. "It does not have to be perfect," she said. "It just has to be yours." Sophie looked down at the sketchbook again, then back at the walls around her, filled with imperfect, honest work. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said. Across the city, Adrian stood at the edge of a busy intersection, the noise of traffic rising around him as he looked out over a place that suddenly felt larger than it ever had before. For the first time, he understood something he had never needed to before. Finding her was not going to be simple. It was not going to be immediate. And it was not something he could solve with authority or influence. It was something he would have to earn. And as he stepped forward into the moving crowd, his path no longer guided by certainty, but by something far less predictable. One thought stayed with him, steady and unrelenting. This time he was the one who had to prove that he was worth finding. The weekend arrived with a quiet kind of anticipation that Sophie had not felt in a long time, not the anxious tension of trying to survive another shift, but something steadier, something rooted in possibility. The small art space transformed slowly as the morning light stretched across the walls, each piece arranged with care, each detail considered not for perfection but for honesty. Sophie stood near the back, her sketchbook open on a narrow table, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the page. She had chosen a few pieces to display, not the most polished ones, but the ones that felt the most true. Faces of strangers, moments of stillness, and among them, one drawing she had almost left behind. Adrian, not as he had appeared in the cafe, but as she had seen him beneath it, controlled on the surface. Something heavier underneath. She had nearly removed it twice before finally letting it stay. Across the city, Adrian moved through a different kind of preparation. Not for a meeting, not for a deal, but for something far less defined. The search had shifted from random streets to patterns, from impulse to intention. He had started paying attention in a way he never had before. Not just to places, but to people. Conversations overheard. Flyers posted in windows. Small mentions of local events he would have ignored in another life. That was how he found it. A simple flyer taped unevenly to the glass of a corner store. Community Art Weekend. Local artists. Open to the public. The words were unremarkable, but something about them held his attention. He studied the address, committing it to memory before stepping back, his decision made before he fully acknowledged it. By late afternoon, the art space filled with a steady flow of visitors, people who moved slowly, thoughtfully, stopping in front of pieces not because they were told to, but because something drew them there. Sophie stood near her small display, her posture calm, but her senses alert, aware of every movement, every pause, every glance that lingered just a little longer. It was unfamiliar being seen like this, not as someone serving, but as someone creating. A couple paused in front of one of her sketches, speaking quietly to each other. "There's something in the eyes," the woman said. "Like, the person is there, even if you do not know them." Sophie felt the words settle softly, not overwhelming, just enough to remind her that she had made the right choice in staying. The door opened again, and this time the shift was immediate, not because of noise or attention, but because of presence. Adrian stepped inside, his gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the space, the people, the art. This was not his world. There were no polished edges here, no controlled conversations, no expectations tied to status or influence. Just honesty, displayed without apology. He moved further inside, his steps slower now, as if adjusting to something unfamiliar. His eyes passed over different pieces, pausing briefly, but never fully settling until something stopped him completely. The sketch was simple, pencil on paper, but the moment he saw it, he knew. It was him, not the version he showed the world, but something deeper, something unguarded. The lines captured not just his features, but the weight behind them, the quiet distance he carried without realizing it. Beneath the drawing, a small card read only one word. Untitled. Adrian stood still, the noise around him fading into the background as he looked at the image, his reflection in it impossible to ignore. For the first time, he saw himself the way someone else had. And it was not what he expected. "You stayed." The voice came softly from behind him, steady, familiar. Adrian turned slowly, his gaze meeting Sophie's. She stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but her eyes clear, grounded in a way they had not been before. There was no hesitation in her now. No need to prove anything. Adrian took a step toward her, stopping just short of closing the distance completely. "I had to find you," he said, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual control. Sophie held his gaze, not surprised, not moved, just present. "Why?" she asked. Adrian hesitated, the question simple, but the answer anything but. He glanced briefly at the sketch, then back at her. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. "About you. About what mattered." Sophie studied him for a moment, the silence between them not uncomfortable, just honest. "That is not new information," she replied calmly. The words were not harsh, but they did not offer him anything to hold on to either. Adrian nodded slowly, accepting it. "No," he admitted, "but this is the first time I understand it." Around them, the room continued to move, people stepping closer, stepping away, unaware of the quiet shift happening between them. Sophie glanced once at the sketch, then back at him. "Understanding something does not undo it," she said. Adrian met her gaze, steady now, not defensive, not controlling. "I know," he replied. "That is why I am here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The past stood between them, unchanged, undeniable. But for the first time, it was not the only thing in the space. Something else had entered. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the possibility of something that could exist beyond what had already been lost. The space between them did not close after his words. It stretched, steady and real, filled with everything that had already happened and everything that could not be undone. Sophie looked at him without flinching, without softening, her expression grounded in something far stronger than the quiet uncertainty she once carried. Adrian stood there, no longer the man who controlled every room he entered, but someone learning, for the first time, how to remain in a moment he could not shape. Around them, the low hum of conversation continued, footsteps echoing softly across the wooden floor, but neither of them moved. "Understanding is not enough," Sophie said after a moment, her voice calm, measured. "You understood in that cafe, too. You just chose what to do with it." Adrian nodded slowly, the truth in her words landing without resistance. "You are right," he said. There was no defense in his tone, no attempt to redirect, just acceptance. Sophie studied him for another second, then shifted her gaze toward the sketch on the wall. "That drawing," she said quietly, "it is not who you are. It is who you looked like to someone who was trying to understand you." Adrian followed her gaze, his eyes settling on the image again, seeing it differently now, not as something that exposed him, but something that revealed how little he had allowed himself to be seen. "And what I look like now?" he asked, the question low, uncertain in a way he was not used to. Sophie turned back to him, her expression unchanged. "That depends," she said, "on what you do next." The words did not offer comfort. They offered responsibility. Adrian held her gaze, something steady beginning to form beneath the uncertainty. "Then let me show you," he said. Sophie shook her head slightly, not dismissive but firm. "You do not get to show me anything," she replied. "Not like this." Adrian paused, absorbing that boundary, adjusting to it instead of pushing against it. "Then what do I do?" he asked. Sophie did not answer immediately. She looked around the room, at the people moving through the space, at the artwork displayed without pretense, at the quiet honesty that filled the air. Then she looked back at him. "You stop thinking this is about fixing something," she said. "It is not a problem you solve. It is a pattern you change." Adrian felt the words settle deeper than anything she had said before. Not because they were harsh, but because they were clear. He had spent his entire life solving, correcting, controlling outcomes. But this was different. This required something he had never practiced. Consistency. Humility. Time. "I can do that," he said, not as a promise to impress her, but as a statement he was beginning to understand himself. Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement that he had finally said something that mattered. "Then start," she said. Adrian looked at her, as if expecting more, but there was nothing else. No instructions. No path laid out for him. Just that single directive. Start. A man approached the display behind them, pausing to look at the sketch of Adrian, tilting his head slightly as he studied it. "There is something unfinished here," he said to no one in particular. Like the story did not end yet. Sophie glanced at the drawing, then at Adrian, her expression unreadable. "Some stories do not end the way people expect," she said quietly. Adrian followed her gaze, the weight of that observation settling in. For the first time, he understood that this was not about earning a moment. It was about becoming someone who would not repeat the same one. Sophie stepped back slightly, creating space again, not out of distance but out of intention. "I have work to do," she said. Adrian nodded, accepting it without question this time. "So do I," he replied. There was no dramatic exit, no final exchange of words meant to define what came next. Just two people standing at the edge of something uncertain, no longer bound by the same misunderstanding, but not yet connected by anything new. As Sophie turned to help another visitor, her focus returning to the world she had chosen for herself, Adrian remained where he was for a moment longer, looking once more at the sketch on the wall. Then he stepped back, not away from her, but into a different way of moving forward. And for the first time, he did not try to control what would happen next. He simply chose to begin. The days that followed did not come with dramatic change, and that was exactly what made them different. Adrian did not return to the art space the next morning or the day after, not because he had lost interest, but because for the first time he understood that showing up uninvited was not the same as showing up with intention. Instead, he returned to his own world, but not in the same way. The glass walls of his office, the quiet efficiency of his team, the constant rhythm of decisions and expectations all remained unchanged on the surface, but something beneath it had shifted. During a meeting that week, a junior assistant presented a report, her voice steady but careful, her eyes occasionally flicking toward him as if measuring his reaction. Halfway through, she paused, clearly unsure if she had made a mistake. In the past, Adrian would have corrected her immediately, precise, efficient, detached. This time, he did something different. "Take your time," he said, his voice calm, giving her space instead of pressure. The room shifted slightly, the tension easing in a way that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. The assistant nodded, regaining her place, continuing with more confidence. It was a small moment, one that would not be remembered by anyone else in the room, but for Adrian, it marked something significant. He was not performing change. He was practicing it. Across the city, Sophie continued working at the art space, her days filled with tasks that were simple but meaningful, arranging displays, assisting visitors, occasionally stepping back to work on her own sketches when the room grew quiet. She noticed the difference in herself too, not in a sudden transformation, but in the absence of something that used to weigh her down. She no longer measured her worth through the reactions of others. She no longer adjusted her presence to fit into spaces that did not value her. The weekend exhibit drew more visitors than expected, word spreading quietly through the neighborhood, bringing in people who stopped not just to look, but to stay. One afternoon, the woman who managed the space approached Sophie with a thoughtful expression. "Someone asked about your work," she said. Sophie looked up, her curiosity immediate but cautious. "Who?" she asked. The woman hesitated for a moment, then handed her a small card. Sophie took it, her fingers brushing lightly over the embossed letters. "Adrian Blake." She stared at it, the name grounding the moment in something real, something she had not expected to follow her here. "He did not come inside," the woman added. "Just left that and asked if you might be interested in a larger exhibition." "No pressure." He said that very clearly. Sophie exhaled slowly, her gaze still fixed on the card. This was different from before. There was no demand attached to it. No expectation, just an opening. She placed the card gently on the table beside her sketchbook, not accepting it, not rejecting it, simply letting it exist. Later that evening, Adrian stood outside the art space, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture still, grounded in a patience he was not used to practicing. He did not step inside. He did not try to see her. He had already done what he came to do. He had offered something, not as a solution, but as an opportunity. Whether she chose to take it was no longer something he could control. The door opened briefly as someone left, a flash of warm light spilling onto the sidewalk before fading again. For a second, he caught a glimpse of the space inside, of movement, of life, of something honest and unguarded. Then it was gone. Adrian remained where he was for another moment, then nodded slightly to himself, as if acknowledging something internal, something steady. He turned and walked away, not with the urgency of someone chasing, but with the quiet determination of someone who understood that change was not proven in a single moment. It was proven in what you chose to do when no one was watching. Inside, Sophie sat at the small table, the card still resting beside her sketchbook, her fingers tracing its edge lightly as she considered what it represented. Not him, not anymore, but the possibility of something she had once wanted, something she had nearly given up on. She looked at her sketches, at the unfinished pieces, at the path she was beginning to build on her own. Then she closed the sketchbook gently, her decision not yet spoken, but forming with clarity. Whatever came next, it would not be defined by what he offered. It would be defined by who she had become. The decision did not come in a single moment. It unfolded quietly, shaped by small realizations that had been building over days, each one adding weight to something Sophie could no longer ignore. She sat in the art space early one morning, before the doors opened, the city still stretching awake outside, her sketchbook resting open in front of her. The card remained beside it, untouched, but never forgotten. Adrian Blake. The name no longer carried the same weight it once had. It was no longer tied to judgment or distance. It had become something else. A question. She traced the edge of the card lightly, then looked at her sketches, at the lines that had once been hidden in the margins of her life, now given space on the walls around her. For the first time, she understood something clearly. This was not about him choosing to see her. It was about her choosing to be seen. That afternoon, she walked into a larger gallery space downtown, the kind she had only passed by before, never imagining she would enter. The floors were polished, the ceilings high, the walls bright with curated collections that carried both recognition and expectation. This was his world, or at least a part of it. She paused just inside the entrance, taking in the space, her posture steady, her breath even. Then she walked forward. Adrian stood near the center of the room, speaking quietly with the gallery director, his expression composed, his presence as controlled as ever. But when he saw her, something shifted instantly. Not in his posture, not in the way others would notice, but in the way his attention centered completely, the rest of the room fading without effort. He ended the conversation without hesitation, stepping toward her, stopping at a distance that respected the space she had chosen to keep between them. "You came," he said, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper than expectation. Sophie met his gaze, her expression clear, grounded. "I came for myself," she replied. Adrian nodded, accepting that distinction without question. "Good," he said quietly. "That is the only reason that matters." There was no attempt to take control of the moment, no immediate explanation, no pressure, just presence. Sophie glanced around the gallery, then back at him. "The offer," she said. "It is real." Adrian did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered, "and it is yours if you want it. No conditions." Sophie studied him for a moment, measuring not his words, but the way he held them. There was no urgency in him now, no need to convince, just a steady openness that had not been there before. "Why?" she asked. Adrian exhaled softly, not out of hesitation, but out of honesty. "Because your work deserves to be here," he said. "Not because of me, not because of what happened, because it stands on its own." Sophie felt the difference immediately. The absence of ownership, the absence of control. This was not a transaction. It was recognition. She looked around the gallery again, imagining her work on these walls, not as something borrowed, but as something earned. Then she looked back at him. "If I do this," she said slowly, "it is not for you." Adrian nodded. "I know, and it does not change what happened," she added. "I know," he repeated. There was no defense in him, no attempt to rewrite the past, just acceptance of it. Sophie let the silence settle between them, not heavy, not strained, just real. As she gave a small nod. Then I will do it, she said. Adrian did not smile immediately. He did not celebrate the answer. Instead, he held her gaze, acknowledging the weight of what she had chosen. You will not regret it, he said. Sophie shook her head slightly. I am not afraid of regret anymore, she replied. The words carried something new. Not defiance. Not uncertainty. Freedom. A gallery assistant approached them briefly, asking a question about placement and scheduling, and Adrian stepped aside, allowing Sophie to answer, to lead, to define how her work would be presented. And she did. Calmly. Confidently. Without hesitation. As the conversation unfolded, Adrian watched, not as someone guiding the process, but as someone witnessing it. And the first time, that was enough. Later, as Sophie stood alone for a moment, looking at the empty wall where her work would soon be displayed, she felt something settle into place. Not because of where she was, but because of how she had arrived there. On her own terms, with her own voice. And somewhere behind her, Adrian remained, not stepping forward, not stepping away, but finally understanding that being part of her story no longer meant standing at the center of it. It meant earning a place at the edge of it, and respecting whatever distance she chose to keep. The opening night of the exhibition arrived with a quiet kind of gravity that could not be measured by noise or crowd size alone, but by presence, by the way people moved through the gallery and paused, not out of obligation, but because something in the work held them there. Sophie stood near the entrance at first, not hidden, not waiting, simply observing as others experienced what she had once kept to herself. Her sketches lined the walls now, each one framed, each one given space and light, no longer tucked away in pages that only she had seen. The drawing of Adrian hung among them, not at the center, not highlighted, but present, part of the story without defining it. People stopped in front of it, just as they did with the others, tilting their heads, studying the lines, speaking quietly to each other. There is honesty in this one, a man said softly to his companion. It feels unfinished but not incomplete. Sophie heard the words as she moved through the room, and for the first time, she did not question whether her work belonged there. She knew it did. Across the gallery, Adrian stood near the back, not drawing attention, not guiding conversations, simply present in a way he had learned to be. He watched as people engaged with her work, as they saw what he had once overlooked, and there was no discomfort in it, only recognition. He had not placed her here. He had opened a door. She had walked through it herself. As the evening unfolded, Sophie spoke with visitors, answering questions, sharing small pieces of her process without over-explaining, her confidence steady, her voice clear. There was no trace of the hesitation she once carried, no need to make herself smaller, to fit into the space. She belonged, and she knew it. At one point, she found herself standing near the sketch of Adrian again, her gaze resting on it briefly before shifting to the reflection in the glass. For a second, she saw both versions at once. The man she had drawn, and the man he had become. You see it differently now. Adrian's voice came from beside her, quiet, not interrupting, just present. Sophie turned slightly, meeting his gaze. I see everything differently now, she replied. Adrian nodded, accepting that without question. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. Just shared. I did not expect anything from you, he said after a moment. Not forgiveness, not a second chance. I only wanted to make sure you had what you deserved. Sophie studied him, not searching for flaws, not testing his words, just listening. You did not give me this, she said gently. You helped me see that I could take it. Adrian let out a quiet breath, something in his expression softening, not with relief, but with understanding. That is enough, he said. Sophie looked back at the sketch one last time, then turned fully toward him. It is, she agreed. The music in the background shifted slightly as more guests filled the space, the room alive with movement and conversation. But in that moment, everything felt steady. Clear. Adrian glanced at her, then toward the exit, as if preparing to leave without disrupting what she had built. Good night, Sophie, he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no lingering expectation, just respect. Sophie held his gaze for a second, then nodded. "Good night, Adrian." He turned and walked toward the door, not looking back, not needing to. And this time, when he left, it did not feel like loss. It felt like completion. Sophie watched him go for a brief moment, then turned back toward the gallery, toward the people, toward the life she had chosen to step into fully. The girl who had once stood in a cafe, trying to disappear into the background, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood her own value, who no longer waited to be seen, who no longer needed anyone else to define her place in the world. And somewhere beyond the walls of the gallery, a man, who once measured people by what they could offer, had learned something far more difficult. That real worth was never something you assigned. It was something you recognized or risked losing forever. The story did not end with them together, not in the way people might expect. It ended with something stronger. Respect earned, growth proven, and two lives changed, not because they needed each other, but because they had learned how to see clearly for the first time.